The first 50 episodes of the Neurokrish Immersion were an exploration, often spontaneous, of how the brain, mind, culture and meaning intersect. They emerged from clinical encounters, from books I was reading, from conversations, from questions that refused to settle. There was no fixed curriculum, only curiosity. As I reflected on that journey, however, one quiet question kept returning. What does freedom actually mean for a human mind? And of course, let me refer you back to the Osho podcast where we sort of looked at this a little bit. We looked at some freedom archetypes. Freedom is not necessarily just political freedom or economic freedom. It's not even freedom from illness or circumstance, but it's an inner sense of being bound or unbound. The feeling that one is living from clarity or from compulsion, from choice or from inherited narratives we rarely examine. In my clinical work across neurology and psychiatry, I've met people who are objectively successful, deeply spiritual, intellectually accomplished, and yet profoundly unfree. And I've also met others living with illness, loss and limitation who carry within them a quiet lightness, a freedom that does not seem to depend on circumstance. Let me illustrate this a little bit. This morning I had a young adolescent with an autism spectrum disorder profile. He is living in a rich inner world. He is so happy and content and pleased with himself. In many ways, I was thinking to myself, this young man is free in a way that his parents and those who care for him cannot hope to be because they are concerned about his well-being, concerned about his future. That too is a form of freedom or not being free. I'm just letting those thoughts sit with you. This episode, therefore, is not intending to be an answer. It's a pause. A moment of synthesis, a doorway into the next phase of our conversations, an invitation to look more closely at what we mean when we speak about the self, about freedom, and about what it means to live wisely in a human nervous system. Let's start by talking about the self that we all carry. Not the philosophical self just yet, not the spiritual self, but the self you wake up with each morning. The self with a name, a history, a profession, a set of roles and responsibilities, a narrative continuity stretching backward and forward in time. The brain does not have really a self center. Instead, what we find is a distributed network, a coalition of regions that together generate a sense of meanness. And this, the heart of this, we call the default mode network. Now, I've referred to this so many times in my different conversations, but let me point you back to the podcast on the monk brain, where we've talked about this. Let me point you back to the podcast on Jivana Devata, the unseen companion. There are many times that we have referred to this default mode network. This network becomes active when we are remembering the past, imagining the future, reflecting on ourselves, simulating other minds, constructing personal meaning, and stories and identities. Stories are not the problem. Stories are how humans organize experience. They give continuity, coherence, identity. The difficulty arises when the story is mistaken for the storyteller, when a functional narrative becomes an unquestioned identity. In Indic traditions, this constructed identity is called ahamkara, the I maker. Let's also think a little bit about the concept of neti, not this, not this. This is a concept not as denial, not as suppression, but as careful discernment. I am not merely my thoughts, not merely my emotions, not merely my memories, not even my roles, is what we are trying to say when we say neti neti. Another way of looking at freedom is as relationship to the self. Before we speak of freedom, it helps us to recognize this. Freedom is not the absence of the self. It is the absence of compulsive belief in the self. And we have several archetypes of freedom. Across cultures and centuries, human beings have related to the self in different ways, not as stages or hierarchies, but as recurring patterns of engagement. We may think of these archetypes of freedom as ways in which the human mind attempts to loosen its own knots. So let's look at these many faces of freedom. The seeker is someone who believes that freedom lies ahead, in knowledge, in insight, in attainment. The seeker reads, listens, practices, accumulates. From a brain perspective, the narrative networks remain highly active. There is a constant comparison. Who I am versus who I could be. Where I am versus where I could be. The seeker is often sincere, often intelligent, often exhausted. In contrast to the seeker, the renunciate turns away from possessions, from relationships, from desire. Here, freedom is imagined as escape. Sometimes this involves suppression of emotion, withdrawal from engagement, a narrowing of experience. Renunciation of this nature can be powerful when born of clarity, but when driven by aversion, the self remains intact, simply relocated to a quieter room. So think in your mind how the seeker and the renunciate are different from each other. The third archetype is the householder sage. This archetype is deeply Indic. Life is not rejected. It is inhabited with discernment. Roles are lived fully, but not absolutized. From a brain perspective, there is greater integration between narrative identity, emotional salience, and executive regulation. Life remains busy, but identification softens. The self loosens not through rejection, but through maturity. The fourth archetype is the artist or mystic. Here, freedom appears in moments, in absorption, in flow, in creation. Neuroscience describes this as transient hypofrontality, a temporary quieting of self-monitoring. The sense of me steps aside, something larger moves through. These states can be luminous, but they are glimpses, not destinations. The danger is romanticizing the experience and trying to possess it. The fifth archetype is the compassionate healer. In genuine service, something curious happens. Attention moves outward. Self-preoccupation diminishes. Boundaries soften. Neural systems involved in empathy and perspective-taking become prominent. Freedom here arises not through self-analysis, but through self-forgetting in relationship. Yet, even here, identity can quietly return. I am the helper, and bondage re-enters through the back door. The next archetype is the liberated one, the Jivan Mukta. This archetype is perhaps the least dramatic. There is no permanent bliss, no theatrical spirituality. What has fallen away is simpler and more radical. The belief that the narrative self is what we fundamentally are. The self continues to function, but it's no longer believed to be the center of reality. Life flows, suffering diminishes, not because pain disappears, but because resistance softens. When you consider all these different archetypes of freedom, you will perhaps see a little bit of yourself in each one of them. In each one of us, there is perhaps a seeker. In each one of us, perhaps there is a moment of Jivan Mukta. And this is something I would like you to think about and consider. Let me now come to a story that I find extremely interesting, extremely enlightening. This is the story from the life of Shankara that I often return to. Not because it's dramatic, but because it quietly dismantles the ego. Shankara, the young philosopher, was walking through the streets of Varanasi one morning, absorbed in thought. Ahead of him stood a chandala, an outcast, accompanied by 4 dogs. In that social world, and of course we are talking centuries ago, this was considered deeply impure. Instinctively, Shankara said, "Move aside." The chandala did not move. Instead, he asked a simple question. Whom did you ask to move? The body or the consciousness that inhabits it? If you believe the body is impure, then how can you avoid impurity in your own body? And if you believe consciousness is one and indivisible, how can it be displaced at all? Shankara was stunned, not intellectually challenged, but existentially exposed. In that moment, the elaborate scaffolding of social identity, ritual purity, intellectual superiority, all fell silent. He bowed, not to the chandala as a person, but to the clarity that had spoken through him. In that instant, freedom was not achieved, it was recognized. What moved Shankara was not a new idea. It was the sudden seeing that the distinction he was defending had no ultimate reality. The mind stopped protecting a story, and something simpler, quieter, truer became visible. That is the kind of freedom we are speaking about. Not dramatic transcendence, not spiritual theatre, just the story loosening its grip. What ties these archetypes together is not destination, but relationship to the self model. Neuroscience tells us the self is emergent, context-dependent, dynamically assembled. Advaita Vedanta offers a complementary insight. The self is not an object of experience. It cannot be grasped. It is what remains when misidentification relaxes. This is not mystical. It's precise. Freedom is not something added to life. It is the removal of a false assumption. This story is who I am. And here, I'd like you to go back and think about the origins of Maya, the podcast where we talked about the story of Krishna and Narada, and how Maya is the veil that comes between us and our ability to witness the self as it should be witnessed. Now, when the story loosens, nothing supernatural occurs. You still wake up. You still age. You still feel joy and grief. But the additional psychological burden, the constant defense of identity, quietly falls away. Many people are surprised by freedom. It does not arrive with fireworks. It does not erase vulnerability. It does not make us special. It feels, in fact, rather ordinary. And perhaps that is its deepest kindness. Freedom allows us to live without constantly protecting a story, to be human without being trapped in the idea of being someone. So I'd like to leave you not with a conclusion, but with a simple noticing. In your own life, observe the moments when the story relaxes, even briefly. A moment of quiet clarity might emerge. a moment of absorption, a moment of kindness without calculation, a moment when effort softens. Something already knows how to live wisely when we stop interfering too much. In the coming conversations, we will gently explore how the brain itself supports and sometimes obstructs this natural intelligence, how perception is constructed, how emotion gives meaning, how rhythm, art, silence, and attention shape the way knowing arises, not as a doctrine, not as a system, but as an inquiry into what it means to live with a little more coherence, a little less noise, and perhaps a little more ease. While we think about all this, I'm going to ask you to go back and think about Shankara and the Chandala. I want you to think about Krishna and Narada and the story of Maya. Sit with it. Meanwhile, thank you for walking this path with me. If you like what we do here at the Neurokrish Immersion, please subscribe and share. We are on Apple, YouTube, and Spotify.